Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Equity Expert Podcast. I'm Jen Namazi, and I'm the Director of Content for the NASPP. Today, I'm joined by our Executive Director, Barbara Baksa, in what is going to be the first of a series of episodes we're doing that is covering some of the data, trends, and observations emerging from the NASPP and Deloitte 2020 Domestic Stock Plan Administration Survey. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to just remind everybody that this episode is part of our Equity Expert podcast series, which features conversations with a variety of professionals about the practices, trends, and career-related topics in the area of stock and executive compensation. You can find the podcast series on our NASPP website, naspp.com. It's also available in the podcast streaming apps such as iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. So you can check those out on your mobile devices as well. So moving on to the topic of the day, before we jump in to just talk about survey data, I want to take a moment to provide some context for this data that we'll be discussing. And the context is really, this data is coming from our 2020 Domestic Stock Plan Administration Survey. This is a joint effort between the National Association of Stock Plan Professionals and Deloitte Consulting, and it provides a detailed look at the administrative practices of companies primarily headquartered in the United States. The topics covered in this survey include stock administration and communication practices, things like staffing and organizational placement of the stock administration function, telework practices, ESPPs, insider trading, and stock ownership guidelines. So this particular episode is going to cover some of the survey highlights related to staffing, telework, and communications. Stay tuned because we will be discussing the findings on some of the other survey sections in some of our future episodes. So you'll want to stay tuned for that. So Barb, I am so glad we have you today because I know you're the brain behind much of what goes on with the surveys and this survey in particular. So we're really grateful to have you on to give some perspective on some of the things that we are seeing.
Thanks, Jen. I'm super happy to be here. I love talking about the survey. I think these surveys are really a fantastic benefit that we offer to our members, and I love any opportunity I have to highlight some of the data that we have in them. And I do want to point out, though, that I'm not the only brain. Deloitte Consulting is our partner on this survey, and they actually contribute a lot to the survey. We absolutely could not do it without them, and this is truly a team effort between us and Deloitte Consulting.
Yes, and I know it's an enormous effort. This survey has a lot of questions and really deep dives into a lot of the practical aspects of administering stock plans. And so definitely a very, very large effort on both sides there.
And also among the NASPP members who participate in the survey, this is no small feat to participate in the survey, and they're sort of the third partner here that really we could not do the survey without their participation as well, and we really appreciate the commitment that they bring year after year as we do these surveys.
That's an excellent point, and I think, without them, it wouldn't be a survey, and
No.
Definitely they shed so much insight into what truly goes on behind the scenes of administering the stock plans in-house within these organizations. So just shifting to some of the findings that we've seen coming out of this particular survey, I know it's interesting because I know we get a lot of questions at the NASPP. Members come to us and ask us a lot of things, and I know one that I've heard a lot, and I know you probably have as well, is where in the organization does stock compensation fall? Like, who oversees this function within the organization? And I know we've seen some trends over the years, and I want to put that to you, Barb, to just see if you can shed some light on some of the things that we're finding.
So that is a question that we get a lot. And when I often hear people say, oh, stock plan administration doesn't really have a home, different companies put it in different places, but actually what we see in the survey is that stock plan administration does have a home, and that home is HR or compensation and benefits. Over 70% of the respondents report that primary responsibility for administration of their stock plan is housed within their human resources organization or within the comp and benefits organization. And that's actually really consistent. Not only is that the case for the current survey, but that has been really consistent almost to the founding of the survey. Like if you go back through, I can go to the last survey we did and the survey before that and the survey before that, and it's always around 60-70% of companies house stock plan administration in HR and comp and benefits. I would say in the 2007 survey that we did just after, so that was the first survey we did after ASC 718 was adopted, and we did see a little bit of a shift at that time to accounting finance. So that was probably the lowest percentage in HR and comp and benefits. It was down to 57% that year, but I think that's probably the lowest that we've seen, and since then it's been sort of steadily climbing back up to HR and comp and benefits is the place to run your stock plan administration from.
Excellent, excellent insight there, and it doesn't surprise me. I think I tend to agree. I feel like that's probably the rightful and congruent home within the organization. So it's good to see those trends falling that way. So another question we get asked a lot as well is, how many people do I need to staff my function in-house? And I know there's so many variables that impact this, everything from like the complexity of the plan to things like global stock plans, and there's a lot that influences what the staffing levels should be, but I know we definitely are seeing some trends emerging there as well. So let's talk for a minute about where that data emerges.
Yes, so that is another question that we get a lot. And I'll tell you one thing that surprises me about this data is how many companies have nobody fully dedicated to managing their stock plan or have just one person doing it. The overall trend that we see is that the more stock plan participants a company has, the more likely they are to have multiple people dedicated to stock plan administration. But overall, 69% of respondents say that they have either nobody fully dedicated full-time to stock plan administration or just one person dedicated full-time to stock plan administration. Now, in the survey, we actually parse that data out by number of stock plan participants because we know that, like I said, that's one of the sort of deciding factors as to how many staff a company might need. And so if I look at really small companies that have less than 250 participants, that percentage drops, or it increases to 86%. So 86% of companies that are really in that very small sector have nobody. In fact, 53% say they have no full-time person dedicated to stock plan administration, and 33% say they have one, and so that totals 86%. And then as I move up to my company size, so that percentage of companies that have zero or just one person dedicated full-time to stock plan administration, it sort of steadily decreases to, if I get to companies with over 5,000 participants, we're down to only 47% are in that bucket. But that's still almost half. So over 5,000 participants, you still have almost half of respondents saying, we don't have anybody who is doing this full-time, or which means it's part of somebody else's job, or we only have one person doing it full time. So that still surprises me. We do see that once we're in that over 5,000 category, a quarter, 25% say that they have 4 or more people dedicated full-time to stock plan administration. Over 5,000 employees is probably that's a pretty big bucket of respondents. So that 25% are probably the largest of the large. But I always am surprised at how low staffing is in this area. I'll just point out, I'll just follow up that to say that we also ask about how many people are contributing to stock plan administration on a part-time basis, and those numbers are a lot higher. So there are lots of people who are doing this sort of part-time as part of another job in most companies, but there aren't a lot of people most companies don't have a lot of full-time stock plan administrators.
And that surprises me as well. And I think it's this balance between like understanding what is actually happening in organizations, which this data suggests that in some, in many cases, there's not a high amount of staffing. On the other hand, it sort of suggests opportunities for improvement, right? And with just so many things to consider from a compliance perspective, it is a little surprising that more organizations don't have sort of a dedicated person to oversee a lot of those aspects of it, which would seem like a best practice, right? To at least have someone tasked with the complete oversight of the function, because I think once you start to parse things out, that's where you can get into sometimes some hot water with, well, I thought this function was handling that compliance piece, or I thought this person was monitoring that. And so I would kind of argue that this data could suggest that there is opportunity to really, examine whether companies can make the resources available to at least have somebody have full oversight of that function.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
All right, so another area, and I feel like this could be a changing or hot topic, particularly in 2020, as I feel like we should point out to our audience that this survey was conducted in the spring of 2020, and our respondents were participating at that time. So this was very early into the COVID pandemic, and likely, had some context that was really prior to the pandemic, but the topic of teleworking comes up, and how are stock plan functions operating? Are they teleworking? Are they coming into companies to work? And I know we've seen some data there that maybe we could talk about for just a moment and kind of frame that also with maybe what we think may happen in the future relative to how COVID is changing things.
Yeah, I agree, Jen. In any other year, this topic would be a non-starter, because what we see in the survey, and this is consistent with the last survey as well, is that very few people who are overseeing stock plans, either on a full-time basis, so they're full-time dedicated to stock plan administration, or even the folks who are contributing as part of their jobs, very few of those people telework. For the folks who are contributing full-time, so who are doing stock plan administration where it's full-time, the only thing that they're doing, 90% said that they do not telework, so only 10% were teleworking. And for the folks who contribute on a part-time basis, so it's part of their job to do stock plan administration, again, 92% said they're in the office, only 8% said they were teleworking. So overall, this is not a job that in the past has been done through telework. But like you said, when we were conducting this survey, it was right at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in the US. It was right at the start of, we were doing it in March. And so that was right when shelter in place orders were going into effect and companies were moving employees to working from home. And I will tell you, at the time that this survey was done, I don't think anybody who participated in this survey would have predicted that here it would be the end of the year and we would all still be in the same boat where we're all still working from home. And it's just gonna, I feel like this is potentially a point in time where we're gonna pivot, where when we do the next survey in another 3 years, maybe we will see these telework numbers significantly change. Now that everyone's been forced to work from home, I think, I've talked to some people who really want to get back to the office, but I've definitely talked to some other stock plan administrators who are saying, it turns out I can do my job from home and I kind of like doing it from home. And I think it will be very interesting to see what happens in 3 years when we do the next survey.
Most definitely. And I know, companies have been kind of trying to figure out what to do as well. And I see, I've heard some companies saying, we're into summer 2021 before they're bringing people back to the office. And then other
Yeah.
companies are taking more of that wait and see approach. And I think the summary, like you said, of all that is that this forced adaptation has really pushed, not only everyone to adapt, but really to rethink and figure out how to thrive in an environment that's telework, whereas this function may have historically been perceived to be, very needed in-house to facilitate communication and meetings and, all the things that go on in-house. Certainly, all these adaptations have changed a lot of the ways that people are perceiving how their work can be done. So it will be really interesting to see whether these trends stick, or if they're pandemic related, or if they just really drive lasting change in how we work. All right, so I'm going to shift over to tax withholding, and this sounds kind of more like a tax topic, but really I think it points to an in-house practice, and a lot, some of these in-house practices are driven by administrative burden or responsibility, or the need to collaborate with other departments. And so that's why this question falls under this particular survey. But there's the concept of excess tax withholding. So withholding more than the minimum required withholding amount on equity plan transactions. And Historically for years, because of accounting regulations, you really couldn't withhold more than the statutory minimum without triggering adverse accounting consequences. However, in recent years, that has been relaxed some, and there is more flexibility to allow additional withholding if employers would desire to do so or permit that for their participants. So I feel like this is kind of a hot question in this particular survey to find out how companies really are, whether they're implementing the allowance of excess tax withholding or not. And so let's just kind of talk through what we're seeing there when it comes to excess tax withholding.
Yes, this continues to be a hot topic for us. The accounting change that you're referring to actually happened in 2016. So I would have thought that this would have sort of settled down by now. And in terms of the survey results, this survey is pretty on par with what we saw in the 2017 survey. So in terms of practices, I think things have stabilized, but I still get a lot of questions about this. It still is, I think, a hot topic for a lot of companies is, do we want to allow employees to request additional withholding on their stock plan transactions? And I think where it really comes up is in the context of RSUs, and particularly where share withholding is where shares will be withheld to cover the taxes, because that's really what the accounting change impacted, is the accounting treatment of that particular transaction. And I would say overall, this is what we saw this year and what we saw in 2017 is the majority of respondents do not allow employees to request additional tax withholding. It's a hassle to have to allow that. For one thing, there was an IRS there's some IRS guidance that came out in 2012 that said that you're not supposed to do this, that if you are going to allow people to request additional withholding, what they're supposed to do is go through the W-4 process. You can't just allow them to sort of fill out a form and say, I want withholding to be done at 37% on my stock plan transactions. If they're not already in that bucket of people who've received over $1 million in supplemental payments, so they're not already subject to the 37% tax rate on their supplemental payments, then you're supposed to withhold at the flat rate, which is currently 22%, and you're not supposed to withhold at any other rate unless the employee is going to request that withholding through their W-4, and you as an employer are going to then make the commitment to withhold at their W-4 rate. And it's actually really complicated to try to figure out that W-4 rate. So it's not surprising to me that a majority of respondents, 63% in this survey, just say, you know what, we don't want to deal with that process. We don't want to have to deal with you submitting a new W-4, us having to figure out the withholding based on your W-4 rate, and then you having to submit yet another W-4 afterwards to set the withholding on your regular pay back down to what it was before the stock plan transaction. Among those respondents that do allow excess tax withholding, most of them are only allowing it for certain individuals or on an exception basis only. So 16% allow it for certain individuals. We didn't ask this in the survey, but I'm going to guess those individuals are the executives. And then 9% are allowing it on an exception basis. And I'm going to, again, bet that those exceptions are for the executives only. There were only 13% of respondents who allow excess withholding on a widespread basis. We also asked a follow-up question where if companies are going to allow excess withholding, do they actually go through the effort of actually following the W-4 process, which is what the IRS has said that it wants them to do? And the majority said no, they don't. 73% said they don't deal with that W-4 process. It is a hassle. And I think one sort of complicating factor here is that although the IRS has issued guidance saying this is what we want you to do, that guidance doesn't address what the penalties to the company would be if they don't follow that guidance. And it's not clear that there would be any penalties to the company. So I think that's why for the minority of respondents who are willing to allow excess tax withholding, I think that's why you see most of them not bothering with the W-4 process, because it's not clear that there is any penalty to them for not doing that.
That makes perfect sense. And the whole W-4 process, I mean, imagine multiplying that by tens or dozens or hundreds of participants. I could see where that could become cumbersome very, very quickly. So that doesn't surprise me, those results. And I guess it's a wait and see to see if the IRS ever takes a stronger position on how they would actually enforce that preference. So the last thing I want to touch on is communication. And the formats of communication have evolved over, the last, well, definitely over the last decade and beyond, but we continue to see a lot of evolution in electronic and digital forms of communication. And so I think one of the things that really comes into question is the balance between historical forms of in-person communication versus all these electronic formats. And one of the things I know we're looking at is, where are companies headed with those formats and how they actually engage and communicate and present information to the employees. So let's talk a little bit about the use of, in-person presentations relative to those electronic mediums.
Sure. So I'll just start off by saying that overall distribution of grant agreements is almost universally done electronically right now. Almost all respondents to the survey accept an electronic signature on their grant agreements, and I remember, and it was clearly a long time ago, because in order for me to find a survey where it wasn't nearly universal that companies were allowing this, I have to go all the way back to 2007. So that's more than a decade ago. But I guess I've been in the industry long enough that I can remember that. But I remember when electronic grant distribution was like a new thing, and I was going to conversations about how do you do this new thing, and should you do it, and electronic signatures, will they be recognized in a court of law, and now that's just standard operating procedures. There are very few companies in the survey that don't do those things. Where we are seeing a shift right now that I think is interesting to me is education and how we're educating our employees. And I'll just remind everybody that, as we've already said, this survey was conducted in March. So this was before, really, when people were responding to the survey, they weren't thinking about what are our practices now under COVID. They were answering for what their practice had been, what their practices were before COVID hit. And everyone still thought that this situation where we're working from home was a temporary thing. And I guess hopefully it is temporary, but it's turned out to be a lot more permanent than I think we thought. So in this particular survey, one of the things we ask is, do you provide presentations to your employees? And if you provide them, how do you deliver them? Are they in person? Do you do a webinar? Do you do conference call, video, something else? And the in-person presentations, only 55% of companies right now in this survey were offering in-person presentations to their employees. And what's interesting to me is that's down from 70% in 2017. So that's a pretty significant drop in just 3 years in the percentage of companies that are using in-person presentations. And at the same time, the use of webinars was up. 63% of respondents said that they use webinars, compared to just 38% 3 years ago in 2017. So already before COVID hit, we were seeing companies really shift from in-person to webinars. And I have to believe that COVID is only going to further accelerate that shift. And I expect, especially now, even if everybody can go back into the office, these days, most companies are so dispersed. There are very few companies where everybody works out of the same office. And so I have to believe that even if we all come back to the office and everyone's working in the office again, you're still going to have your stock plan participants working in probably many different offices. And so I have to believe that, especially with COVID, that this is really going to accelerate this, and that this is a practice that's going to continue. And eventually, we may see actually very few companies doing in-person presentations for their employees.
So that one was a really interesting one for me, because on the one hand, I'm happy to see like a lot of digital evolution. And I think, there's always this balance between like embracing the new, right? Like new forms of technology. And we've certainly seen a lot of that over the last several years. And then there's this other concept of like, finding balance between human contact and
Right.
all this digital format. And I know we put in the advisor, one of our administrators' corners, and then I think we have a blog on this topic as well. But there, I had done some research on kind of communicating across the generations of the workforce. And one of the things at the time that surprised me was that there was an element still of even among the younger generations of actually wanting human contact, right? Like, right, some form of personal or in-person communication. And that really surprised me, because I thought, in person was kind of going the way of dinosaurs, and we were just going very digital with how we interact and communicate, and with things like Zoom and video meetings and things, that certainly helps put a face across time zones or locations. So I feel like that will be interesting to see whether companies continue that trend of really just focusing on moving away from the in-person, or if they get to a point where it's kind of a realization that there is still a home for in-person communications within your whole communication portfolio. So I'm curious to see how that will continue to evolve, and whether we'll continue to see those numbers increase, or sort of stabilize, or even kind of reverse a little bit as time goes by.
Yes, I agree with you that in person, the technology isn't there yet. It's still not, a Zoom meeting does not replace an in-person meeting. But I think now that we've all had to get so comfortable with doing online meetings and using these various tools that are available to us, I have to believe that companies are going to continue to do that. There are really, I think, some advantages and some cost efficiencies of doing online meetings. I still think there's probably a role for in-person assistance to employees, but I'm not sure it's a presentation, because when you think about, if you're going to an in-person presentation, oftentimes there's a lot of material to cover. The speaker, when was the last time you went to an in-person presentation where there was enough time for questions at the end? There's a lot of material to cover. Speakers oftentimes don't have enough questions, and you're in like a whole big group. And if you are an employee and you're trying to understand your stock compensation plan, or your stock compensation awards, in a group with everybody else, where you maybe feel like your questions are stupid, or this is your own personal compensation, I have to believe that employees might be actually a little bit uncomfortable about asking questions in that environment. And so maybe the in-person part ends up being more one-on-one between the stock plan administrator and employees who need assistance, or through the company's financial wellness program. We just had a session at the NASPP conference on a couple different companies that were doing some very interesting financial wellness things, and one of them was NVIDIA, and they actually have a financial financial advisor who's on site at their company once a week to schedule meetings with employees and have one-on-one sessions with them. And I almost wonder if that's maybe the way of the future for in-person assistance, and for when we're trying to just reach a lot of employees all at once, maybe online is a better tool.
I think that's a fantastic point. I think you're absolutely right. Separating the historical, like in-person presentation of information, from in-person contact, which could be one-on-one, or really just to help answer questions, or kind of give a, personal experience to somebody in a different type of format than just a presentation. I agree. I feel like now that we've all had to adapt to even video presentations, and really communicating remotely, I think our skills have all jumped way ahead this year, 2020. So, all right. Well, with that really wraps up some of the trends we wanted to highlight today. And I know we'll be covering more in some other episodes, other parts of the survey. So definitely want to invite everybody back to listen to those episodes. And Barb, I want to thank you for jumping in and sharing your perspective and joining us on this episode.
Thanks for having me. Like I said, I'm always happy to talk about the survey.
And we're thrilled to have you talk about it, because there's definitely a lot of insight that you bring to the table there. So, and for those who are looking for more information about this survey, we will be hosting a webcast, our October webcast, scheduled for October 21st at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, is going to provide a more in-depth view on all of the survey highlights. And we will continue to cover, as I mentioned, these survey findings in other podcast episodes as well. The full results of the survey, for those who are wondering about that, will be available to qualifying NASPP members later this year. We do make those results available to companies who participated in the survey, as well as some other segments of members that didn't have an ability to participate. But for more information on that, you can visit our website, go to our research center, and access the survey section of our research center, and you'll be able to find more information on all the surveys that we have. And then we will look forward to seeing you all on the next episode. Be sure to subscribe if you want to be notified about future episodes. You can do that through your podcast app, or via the podcast page on our website. That is naspp.com/podcast. plural with an S. You'll be notified by email when those episodes are available if you do that through our website. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you on the next episode.